Hello, my name's John Froelich, and I'm a Senior Vice President at Bramasol, the leaders in order-to-cash to compliance solutions using SAP. We help you ignite possible. I'm here to share with you some insights and learnings from current projects we did and a presentation that I recently gave at the TAC Insights BRIM/order-to-cash to compliance conference that was attended by over 50 people. From companies as large as Fortune 10 all the way down to smaller companies. And I'm excited to share this information with you. First, let me introduce for a second why Bramasol. Why are we here today to talk about this? Well, I want to point out a couple of key things. Number one is we are the leaders in quote-to-cash to compliance transformation and enablement. What do I mean by that? We help businesses really think about the new business models and the new go-to-market models they have, whether it's in B2B, B2C, or B2B2C. And we use this diagram on the right-hand side here to help you think about this circular engagement model from customers engaging from your end customers engaging from commerce, picking a solution, designing that solution, ordering it, and then fulfilling on all of that all the way through billing, invoicing, and finally compliance and reporting, and how it's a circular transaction and keeps going on and on. Why Bramasol, though? Well, because we're passionate about quote-to-cash and revenue recognition. We've been doing this for a really long time, and we really love this work and want you to learn more about it and take advantage of the power of SAP. Our quote-to-cash experience, however, comes from a unique perspective. As the leaders in revenue recognition for SAP solutions, we're able to bring a unique perspective. Take, for example, the concept of looking through an order window where orders are being passed through the window, and on the back end, somebody has to fulfill those orders, or they're passing boxes and you have to put them away. Imagine that that was blind and nobody could see each other, the confusion that would result. From our perspective of the person putting those boxes away, imagine that we look forward and could help you figure out the most fast and efficient way to manage that piece of that process. Finally, we continue to be at the forefront of innovation with SAP with an industry-focused expertise. We've helped numerous businesses really overcome some of the complexities and challenges of both heterogeneous environments in which they may be using some SAP, some non-SAP, some personal solutions, or homogeneous all SAP solutions. And because we're authentic and genuine, we want to be here with you. We're not the coach sitting on the sideline. We're the caddy walking the course with you, giving you advice right there on the field. So with that in mind, let me share some perspectives that we've gained in many of these projects. First, let me take a moment to introduce and say, well, why are we here? What are our goals for this presentation? Number one, I'd like to provide you with a different perspective on the order-to-cash to compliance. I hinted at it before, thinking of it as either a pass-through or a hole in which somebody is dumping things down the hole on the top, the sales guys, and somebody in finance has to file all of those and put them in the right place, make sure they're appropriately ordered. Well, imagine if you can't see each other, what the confusion is. So I want to give you a different perspective. I'm going to give you some practical insights on key projects. We'll talk about the challenges and should suggest some ideas. And then we'll wrap it up, I think, with something I'd like you to walk away and think about. So with that in mind, let's focus on, let me give you some background. So what is this unique or different perspective that we're talking about? Well, again, let's take the perspective of the five-step model. The five-step model is the core of the revenue recognition standards, whether it's ASC 606 or IFRS 15. And it goes by 5 different buckets. Number one, identify the contract with the customer. Well, why is this important for you in an order-to-cash model? Well, think about your principal versus agent. Are you selling or do you have a distributor? Are you doing revenue sharing as so many companies are doing today? For example, large media companies who may share through apps on their sites using an app developed in Apple or Google or another transaction. Imagine, how would you manage that revenue sharing process? What about licensing and royalties? In the five-step model, we now have to identify what exactly am I selling to the customer? We call those performance obligations. What is the customer taking ownership of? In many cases, we need to identify what they are, and that's pretty simple. They're buying a box, they're buying a service or software. But do we understand how those are being laid out? Is it a time-based obligation? Is it event-based? By the way, a subscription model can be both a time or an event-based model based on how you lay that out. Are you doing POC, or percent of complete? We have hybrid models in which you might have time and event-based. And do you have linked or nested performance obligations? If you buy product A, do you always get product B? But you only buy product A, it's just understood that you get all of those, and how are they nested or linked underneath? All things to think about, not just as you think about RevRec, but how are you bundling those in the front? How are you provisioning those? How are you thinking about those bundles? Speaking of bundles, how will you determine the transaction price? In this case, it's pretty easy if I sell you a cell phone with a service model and a subscription, but what if that subscription is evergreen? What if in the first 2 years you sell it at a discounted price, but then it goes up to a standard flat rate after you go off your 2-year obligation? What if you have usage and consumption models built in, and those usage and consumption models include tiered pricing? How are you doing that on the front end? How are you determining what those pricing models are, what you call a bundle? Because as you execute against that, whether you're collecting money or you're fulfilling it or you're doing RevRec, how do all of those relate together? Fourth step is the allocation of that transaction price. You have to look at every single element. In the new regulations and in the new world, there's no such thing as a freebie. Freebies are gone. So how are you going to price that? We always used to use the idea of, when I get a phone and I get a free selfie stick to go with it, that selfie stick has value. How do you assign that value? The tool for that is standalone selling price. But if you have different approaches to it, how are you maintaining that? What about carve-ins and carve-outs? We call those in the RevRec world variable consideration. What if you have commissions? What if you have financing? What if part of it's related to a subscription or usage-based? How will you allocate the value of those transactions and the value of those elements so that you, as an end user, understand the true revenue that you're getting from each product area, the true value the customer receives? How are you reporting that? And finally, the easy part that everybody says is the easy part, you're going to recognize the revenue. Okay, but are you recognizing it when you buy contract, or will we be using a bill plan? Are you using a sales order? So I create a sales order. Yep, the minute I create a sales order, I create a plan. Or is it going to be based individually on invoice? Or will it be based on the fact that you collected money? So you need to make decisions about that. What are you going to do about free trials and free periods? All of that has an implication up front, downstream. How will you count that revenue? And finally, cancellations or contract validations. What if I have cancellations? What if I allow the customer to cancel? How do I value that? How do I recognize that? How do I change my RevRec over time? What if I have an upfront fee that gets allocated? And then contract validations. In many cases, customers will say, I'll do a 1 to 3 year set of contracts, but each year I have to validate that I want to renew, as opposed to an auto-renew methodology. Again, if you holistically look at all of this, you want to maybe think about how the 5-step model can help you think about and approach a framework for your overall order to cash. Another area that we think you ought to think about is one we've been using very successfully, both in the order to cash as well as revenue recognition, which is this idea of volume, velocity, density, and complexity. Volume, I think, is pretty easy. It's how many. Many customers only have thousands of items that they're counting every month, even dozens in some cases. Others, some of our customers have tens of millions, even others have hundreds of millions every month. How will that impact how you do your pricing models, your collections, your allocations? How do you link it to revenue recognition? How will you manage all of that data? Velocity. It's one thing to have hundreds or thousands every quarter, but what if you have tens of thousands or tens of millions every day? How will you manage that? Quarterly data, daily, real time. That will affect your interfaces. That will affect your ability to view all of that data, where you collect and store that data. What about density? Well, what do I mean by density? Well, think about your contracts. Do your contracts have a large number of POBs? Right? We talked about performance obligations. Is it 1, 2, 3, or is it hundreds? In the case of large enterprise contracts, you could be buying cell phones for your business, and the contract has hundreds of different cell phones along with hundreds of different numbers, et cetera, et cetera. All the same, but maybe there's a lot of them in there. And finally, complexity. Yes, they are different. Complexity and density are different. Complexity, you could have only 5 to 10 different items in each contract, but how are those items interrelated? Remember how we talked in the previous slide about bundles. What's the difference between bundle A, bundle B, and bundle C? How are they interrelated? Or how are the elements within them interrelated if you're offering a product, software, service, consulting, and availability to other content? How do they interrelate, and how will you map those together in parent-child? As the parent of children who gamed a lot, you think about things like downloadable content. What rights do I have to download additional content? So material rights become a very intricate part of this complex model. So with that in mind, I want you to think about these two areas, the 5-step model and this new lens, volume, velocity, density, and complexity. I'm going to give you 3 project examples, some learnings that we have, and I hope you'll take something away from this. But this information was obtained by interviewing over a dozen different companies across different industries, as well as through learnings from our own 100+ different projects. The first one I want to use is a real-world example that focuses on volume and velocity. We got this from technology companies, large technology companies that I'm sure many of you all know. They provide computers, they provide phones, they provide learning devices, all kinds of different companies like that. We have media and advertising being both pure advertising organizations, media companies we're familiar with, but also think of content providers also fit into this. And finally, transportation. And transportation can be as wide as ride providing organizations, traditional railroads, trucking, any transportation. Enormous volumes make reporting and tracking challenging. As I said before, imagine that in these spaces where you have tens of millions of contracts every day, you click a button, you buy an app. You click a button, you buy some extra Angry Birds options. All of those happen real time, and millions of them happen each day. Where are you storing that volume? How are you relating those together? Maybe for you, the individual transactions aren't material, but the aggregate itself has huge impacts. Maybe you're downloading songs, or you're downloading content. It could be books. It could be a lot of things. Individually, they're worth $1, $2 each, but when you aggregate it all together, it becomes tens of millions of dollars. And of course, depending on when, where, and how RevRec is done, again, the storing of that data for how long and where might become challenging. In our projects, we've gotten a few learning and insights that I'd like to share with you. Number one is consider using a portfolio approach. Consider bundling all of these things together. If, for example, you have a particular provider that does a significant amount of your business, maybe you don't need to go to an individual level. You can use the provider as that part of your portfolio approach. Second, focus on assigning the right task to the right module or solution area. If you're on a sports team, you don't give the goalie the assignment of scoring goals. His job is to stop the other team from getting goals. Similarly, on any team or any area, you want to focus the right task on the right module. When it comes to revenue recognition, empower RevRec to do the job it does by simplifying and automating RevRec, not by doing your sales and distribution projects or integrating your invoices. Those should be done by different areas. I can't talk enough about data mapping and mediation. They are absolutely crucial. In a previous video, we talked about that with our friends from Digital Root. Data mediation and mapping is critical. Every single one of these pieces of data could be coming from different systems in different formats. You could have a four-character field in one application, a 12-character field in another, and an 8-character field in yet another one, but all of them mean widget. Well, how am I mapping those together and ensuring that when I see widget in all these different places, that widget matches together? Another really important one that I ask you to consider is the idea of parallel processing or parallelization. The idea is to divide the task of running all of these different tasks or these steps into individual smaller buckets. If you had 1 million, you could process that and break it up into 10,000 increments. Break those 10,000 increments into smaller bits so that you can parallelize that process, and it allows you to manage and monitor errors more closely. Imagine, for example, that you had 10 million items that you were processing. It took 2 hours to process them, and you ended up with 0.01% error rate. That's about 10,000 errors to review. And by the way, you can't process all the other ones until you've finished. If you could parallelize that, you could turn it into 2 each time. Imagine how fast you could look at 2. So those are some real-world examples we've learned. Volume and velocity matter, but there are tools out there and processes and thoughts to help you deal with that. The next area I'll talk about is density. Now, this came from some of the software and consulting areas. Again, density, think of it as how many elements do I have on there? Well, imagine that I have a software contract with all kinds of different abilities. If you had a software that you ordered, and you could order 32 different types for different user types for different time frames, all of a sudden you get a very dense level, a number of pieces in there. Media, of course, can be extremely dense as you think of advertising on sites or in other areas. Technology, if I order a large computer, I order databases, I order all kinds of different things. That technology can include many, many, many different components, many, many different elements associated with bringing it up. And of course, transportation, we know, if you're a railroad shipping a rail car worth of stuff, that could be tens of thousands of items just there, each one of those driving 4 or 5 different transactions in the fact that they have waybills, right? Issues are enterprise level contracts can have hundreds, even thousands of SKUs. What happens when you modify, which will happen? That can multiply this effect. What happens then? How are you going to track entitlements? And when you track the entitlements, what's the implications both upstream and downstream to the fulfillments? Those effects can be complex. You probably need a tool for that. Simple solutions upstream can have huge impacts downstream. Just taking a 4-year contract, dividing it into 4 different 1-year contracts, because it's easier that way for the sales rep, may have huge implications as you have to merge those contracts downstream and understand the implications of each of them. What we would suggest is you consider ensuring your SKUs are on the same order or in the same order, rather, or on a sales order or in a contract. Often we find that it's fairly random. It's easier to sort through it if I always put line items SKU 1, 2, 3 first, 1, 2, 4 second, 1, 2, 5 third. Not always possible, but it's a great suggestion. You ought to consider it. Use the Pareto approach for automation. It's the 80-20 rule. You don't have to automate everything. Sometimes if you have some complex transactions that require a lot of customization, you may decide that, hey, that's only 0.1% or 1% of the work that I have to do. I can automate 99% of it and let that 1% go if that would severely impact the time and effort taken to do it otherwise. Again, have a robust entitlements management process and solution. SAP has a great one. We would suggest you take a look at it, but I'm not here to sell you. I'm just saying have a robust entitlement management process. Finally, think about the basic building blocks. For example, if you're a transportation company and you're doing multimodal transportation, is your basic building block the pallet that goes into the container? Is it a sub-pallet level? Is it the container? Oh, I'm going to put it on a truck, or I'm going to put it on a train so it has a train car with a couple of different containers on it. Is that your box? Or if you're a large shipper and you're using ships, is a ship your basic building block? What do you want to be the basic building blocks, and how do those basic building blocks drive profitability and insights for your business and for your customers? Next, and finally, I want you to consider complexity. So how does complexity relate to this? Technology obviously is one. Media content, we talked about that. Software and gaming, yet again, the interrelationship with if you buy A, it entitles you to B. But if you use, or you buy A, it entitles you to B, C, and D. But if you activate D, it also gives you E, F, G, H, yada, you get the picture. How are you going to deal with those issues? How do you deal with complex bundling strategies with, as I mentioned, child, parent, grandparent relationships? How will you deal with complex discounting and pricing strategies? What are the tiers? How are you doing consumption? What are some of your material rights? Finally, how do you want to deal with in-app purchases? In-app purchases can create large data volumes because you're having many of them from multiple sources, but it can also create double entries. What do I mean by double entries? Well, when you get that app and you have to provision that app and turn it on, it's in one place, but when you're paying for it, it's in another, and when you RevRec, maybe it's in another. How are you doing that? Again, on learnings and insights from this, think about the product catalog. How does your product catalog itself, whether it's online or a physical catalog, relate to a POB? How do those map one-to-one? And again, going back to what we said before, data. Clarify and manage your standalone selling price. This goes to your discount strategies. Not only can you have complex discounting strategies as a business, but you can have it across multiple regions. What are your discount strategies in Japan versus the US? In Japan, discounting is very low, but you start with a lower price. In the US, you often have large discount strategies. Software discounts far differently than medical devices. So think about all of that as you manage your standalone selling price. What approach will you use? And again, you can use tools. We have tools available to help you manage that. I talked about the basic building blocks, absolutely essential. We talked about that in the previous slide. Again, it relates to this idea of complexity. What are you measuring at? And again, I mentioned the robust entitlements management. So I hope that these three things, these approaches, gave you some interesting things to consider in a different perspective. Previously in other webinars, webcasts, and in person, I also asked you to consider or ask customers to think about 3 other areas: data, process, and integrations. In the case of data, we've talked about that. Really think about having a proper data mediation tool, but think about your data in the terms of accuracy, in terms of applicability, in terms of adequacy, and in terms of volumes. All of those things need to be managed in a holistic manner to understand, because at the end of the day, it's all about the data. But that data is driven by process. Look at your process, map out your process overall, but most importantly, look at the key intersection points of your different processes. It's important to understand the processes within themselves, but more important is, where do those processes interlink? Where do they interact? You can look at those as opportunities to rationalize data or gain some efficiencies. And finally, integrations. Not all integrations are the same. Native integration is different than APIs, which is different from other mediation tools that you might use, which is very different from customizations. Manage those integrations, because as you move and you grow your business, add new aspects to your business, those integrations can and will change. You need to manage that process. So let me kind of wrap this up for you in a little box. I hope here I've provided a different perspective on the order to cash to compliance. It is a complete holistic process. We gave you an insight or a specific perspective of looking backwards to the front. My friend Stephen Covey used to say, begin with the end in mind. Take a look at what you're trying to measure. Take a look at how you have to measure that, and how do your upfront systems not only enable your customers, but enable your business to track things accurately. I provided you some specific insights from projects. We talked about the implications of volume and velocity, and how you can use tools like parallelization to smooth that volume and velocity and give you high response, real-time information, but do it in a way that is manageable. We talked about density and how you can use data models to do that, to think about your basic building blocks and tools. And finally, we talked about complexity, and again, the idea of really matching your POBs and your product catalogs, thoughtfully thinking about the implications of bundling and tiering strategies. I promised, or I suggested that I'd give you something else to think about. I gave you the 5-step model, and I do want you to think about the 5-step model as you move forward as a mechanism for implementing your order-to-cash process to compliance. And we talked about volume, velocity, density, and complexity. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring up what we all know to be true, and that is change. No matter where you start from, you will be somewhere else 6 months, 6 years, or 6 decades down the road. That is so important to think about as you map out your model from all the way from customer engagement through pricing and billing, through revenue recognition. How will it change? Not just how will the order from the customer is doing will change, not just that your pricing will change, your business models will change, the world will change, technology will change. A phenomenal example of this as we wrap up is artificial intelligence. How will artificial intelligence change the way your customers engage with you? Change the way that you engage with the customer in terms of understanding their needs, and how will it enable you to pull out the kinds of information and data that you want and need? That has to be overlaid, and that change is crucial to what we're doing. So with that in mind, I want to thank you for taking your time out of your day to listen to what I have to say. As always, you can reach out to us at bramasol.com to learn more. I want to thank you for your time and hope you have a great day.